Join us in a festival that promises to be extraordinary, because Bali is extraordinary.
Is an easy, a good and a very important read. Essentially is about the story of an allied, mainly Australian, but also New Zealand and British, an allied special operations operation in Borneo in the final months of World War II, a special forces or guerrilla operation designed to soften up the Japanese for what would ultimately be an allied invasion of Borneo. To get the historical crosshairs on the book, I think it's important to go back to the colonial history of Borneo. So prior to the Japanese invasion during World War II, Borneo was essentially comprised of what was described as British North Borneo, what we would now know as Sarawak, Sabah and Brunei. And then the rest of Borneo was Dutch Borneo, which of course was part of the Dutch East Indies. Post World War II and decolonisation, Sarawak and Sabah became part of the Federation of Malaysia. The Dutch Borneo became the 5 Kalimantan provinces, North, South, East and West and Central. And Brunei subsequently emerged from a British protectorate to an independent sovereign nation in its own right. And so, ironically, in some respects, the Japanese occupation was the first and only time in modern history where Borneo has been ruled by one particular country. We now have Indonesia, Malaysia and Brunei forming forming or holding their portions of the island of Brunei. Second historical point is that this was, of course, a Z unit or a Z force special operation, sometimes referred to as the Special Reconnaissance Division. And historically, this, of course, was the precursor to Australia's modern special operations capability, which in Perth we're very familiar with through the Special Air Services Regiment at Swanbourne, but also more recently 2 Commando or 2nd Commando in New South Wales. And so there are some significant historical links here. So if I can just briefly introduce Christine. Christine is a very well-known and highly regarded academic. Her specialty for 30 to 40 years has been anthropology and sociology, and she's made her specialty the study of the Dayak people of Borneo. And she first visited Borneo to commence her study some 40 years ago, back in the 1980s, and has regularly visited and studied the Dayak people ever since. She's a prolific author, academic author and publisher, but until this book has essentially specialised in those peer-reviewed academic contributions. This is the first time that she's published a book which is aimed at a broader or wider audience, and I want to interrogate Christine about some aspects of that. So without further ado, I can't yet see Christine on my screen, but she'll come up when I talk to her. Okay, Christine, I'm going to please and kindly talk to you. So let's see if we find you on our screen.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that lovely introduction. Am I there on your screen?
Yes, you're there on the screen, and
let me just say thank you to the audience as well, whom I can't see, but I'm hoping that there's some audience there. And let me just say thank you to you lucky people from lockdown Canberra. It's a treat to be able to get out on a Saturday evening.
Yeah, well, I can tell that it's 7:15 in Canberra, but you've also told me earlier in the day that it's a delightful spring day in Canberra, which I do remember, although currently we have slightly more freedoms here than you do. But Christine, let me start off by asking you, you've spent all of your career, all of your life at the ANU writing academic journals from a sociological and anthropological point of view, and you've done that in a voluminous way for a long period of time. How did you make the shift to writing a book for a more general audience, and how did you, in a sense, train yourself from not writing an academic piece, but writing something which would be informative, educative and interesting from a more general consumption perspective?
Yes, it's a really interesting question. It was hard. I mean, I think, let me say first of all that I don't think I was moving away from academic writing. I wanted the book to retain the good things about academic scholarship, you know, the rigour, the range of sources, the pursuit of what we might call the truth, you know, trying to get things right, which I think is one of the really good things about academic work. But yes, academic writing is the problem, isn't it? It tends to be incredibly impenetrable. I think most academics just write very, very badly. They write this terribly inaccessible, impenetrable prose. And I wanted to find a way to move away from that. So initially I thought, oh, this will be fairly easy. I'll just get rid of all the jargon. I'll get rid of these nitpicky arguments that academics are keen to make. And I'll just, you know, and once I've done that, it'll be fine. So I did that with the first chapter that I wrote, which was a chapter from the middle of the book. And I felt very pleased with myself, and I put it aside for several days, and I came back and I read it, and what I'd written was an academic article. So then I thought, oh, this is actually going to be a little more difficult than I had thought. So the first thing I did was I actually went to some of my favourite non-fiction writers. So I went and I had a look at Nick Thomas has written a wonderful book called Discoveries, which is about Captain Cook in the Pacific. So it was similar to what I was writing about. There was a sort of a lot of first contact stuff, which I was writing about as well. I went and I looked at people like, what's his name, Oliver Sacks, who I've always really loved, just to sort of see how these people who were writing stuff that at one level was academic were nevertheless making it accessible to a broader audience. And then I went and I looked at some of the truly great military pieces of writing. And I think the one that probably influenced me the most, in fact, was T. Lawrence's Seven Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence of Arabia's, that great, great book. It's a wonderful book. I actually read it again before I wrote this. And he was doing there what I wanted to do in this book, which was capture the feeling of the place. I mean, those wonderful descriptions he has of the desert and the rocks and the shifting colours and the wind and so on. I wanted to build some of that into mine. And then once I'd done that, I also thought I should try to get a feel for how contemporary military writers were writing. So I went to a Dayaks bookshop, the local one here in Canberra, and I sat down with military in the military history section for an afternoon. And I looked at people like Paul Hand, Peter Fitzsimons, and so on, just to see how they were writing. And I realised that what I needed to be doing was shortening my sentences. I needed to be shortening my chapters. But most of all, I realised that I was allowed to use adjectives. It was a great liberating experience. I could use adjectives and I could describe things in a way that you're just not allowed to in academic writing. You can't say in academic writing, you know, the sparkling river or, you know, the trees shrouded in leaves or whatever. You just don't do that. And it was actually, I have to say, Stephen, hugely more fun once I realised that I could do all these things than any academic writing I've ever done. So it was hard to start with, but after about 2 chapters, I just found it exhilarating and liberating.
Well, I have to tell the audience that there are very many aspects of the book which remains a sort of a peer-reviewed academic piece. There's no shortage of footnotes, there's no shortage of reference to publications, there's no shortage of glossaries, there's no shortage of appendices. So you certainly met that, but you've also seemed to have taken an academic approach to learning a new skill by reading widely and then sitting down, you know, in Dayaks in Canberra by yourself, not being bothered by anyone, reading Peter Fitzsimons to make sure that you got the right sort of populist approach to it.
Yeah.
But I think the second thing you had to adapt to is you spent 40 years of an academic career writing about the Dayak people from a sociological and anthropological perspective, and then quite late in the piece 2014, 2015, you're asked to start doing some work to provide an input into an accurate military history of the contribution that the Dayak people made and the Z unit forces made in this operation. And so how did you go from viewing the Dayak contribution from a sociological anthropology perspective to in a sense, military historian perspective or a military operation perspective, bearing in mind that at this stage you were also what you self-described as an anti-war activist. So you had to make another adjustment as well. How did you manage that? How did you find going from the sociological to the military?
So again, actually, it's interesting because following on from the first question, I suppose I didn't see it as an either or. I mean, I'm an anthropologist. I've been an anthropologist for 40 years. I will always be an anthropologist. And so in a sense, I suppose I took as my task to, in a way, anthropologize the military histories that had been written up. So I think most of the reviewers who have reviewed this book, many of them have said it's not in any sense a conventional military history. And I think one of the things that, and you might feel the same, one of the things that makes it unconventional is precisely that there is still a very strong anthropological strain that runs through this book. You're constantly getting the Dayak perspective on the war, the Dayak perspective on, the Dayak worldview, I guess. I've tried to constantly build those in. And I think there's also, one might say, a sort of a degree of cultural relativism in the book as well. I try hard to get the reader to understand things like headhunting, which some Dayak groups were practicing and which took place as part of this operation. And I've taken my role to get the reader to understand that, not to judge it, but to try to understand it. So I think it's still, I would see it as still, in many respects, a very anthropological book. But yes, you're right. I then suddenly was confronted with having to do something about this military stuff, which I not only knew absolutely nothing about, I mean zilch, but I had long had a kind of deep antipathy to knowing very much about. And that was very hard. I had to plough through probably over 1,000 documents, military documents in archives. It was a nightmare on many fronts, not least all the bloody acronyms that all of these military documents, you're probably aware of this yourself. I would read a document, it was like trying to learn a new language. Some of these acronyms like POW, I knew that meant prisoner of war, but OR for other ranks. I mean, it was just trying to learn a completely new language. And then also recognizing that so much in the official documents, especially, so much was being left out. And so I was having to sort of factor that in to the way I was writing as well. So it was hard. I can't deny it was hard.
Well, you suffered the same difficulty that every defence minister has suffered. When I was Defence Minister, after a week or so, I sent down a memo to the Secretary and the Chief of the Defence Force saying, could we please stop all the acronyms and just at least explain what it means the first time and put the acronyms in brackets after, and after 2 weeks, the office gave up saying, we'll just have to work our way through this. It's just culturally unable to be interfered with. The other, I think, very interesting, and you make the point about once an anthropologist, always an anthropologist. The other interesting thing from my perspective when I read the book is that you're being asked to give a history of what occurred essentially in 1945. But when you're asked to start thinking and writing about that, it's 2015. It's a long time after, but you make the point in the book on numerous occasions that you started to travel to Borneo and to start studying the Dayak people back in the 80s, at which point in time Borneo and the jungles and the general habitat and the lifestyle and the practices of the Dayak people much more closely resembled 1945 than they would today. So to what extent did that give you, if you like, an added advantage? If you'd had to go to it clean in 2014, 2015 without that prior on-the-ground work and study, how disadvantaged do you think you would have been in that respect? Because in some of your writing, particularly descriptions of the jungle, it seems to me, and it's beautifully written, that could only come from actually being able to see it almost as it was in 1945, in the 1980s, pre-palm oil, pre-logging and the like. So how did you find that, and trying to recollect what you'd seen back in the 80s, writing in 2015, 2020?
Yes, it's a really good question. I suppose I would go so far as to say that I not only couldn't, but I wouldn't have written this book if I hadn't had all of that prior experience of being in Borneo. I mean, in a sense, I think the book comes out of my own kind of deep attachment to Borneo and my deep respect for Dayak people. And I think that's why it's not a conventional military history. So, and to just sort of answer your question about how difficult would it have been, to try to piece the story together would have been very difficult because, as you know, I've done over 120 interviews for this book. The vast majority of them with very old Dayak people in their 80s and 90s who still remember the war in Borneo. And I couldn't have written this book as it's written. I couldn't have actually pieced the detail together without having done those interviews. And I think also for me, the book came, one reviewer described the book as a lament for Borneo and for the Borneo jungles. And I think I read that and I thought, that's actually true. I hadn't realised until I read that in the review that that was the case. But I think I had a deep sort of drive and a deep desire to write a book that would tell the world how wonderful Borneo once had been, how wonderful those jungles had been, which are now almost completely gone and which, you know, I find heartbreaking. And I tried to write some of that sense of heartbreak into the book as well. So I think that long, long history with Borneo and with Dayak people is sort of deeply informs the entire book.
Well, I want to come to your analysis of the Dayak people's contribution to this special forces operation and the precursor to the reclaiming of Borneo by the Allied Pacific Forces. But before I do that, I just want to deal with the work that you did with Australian veterans. So people who go off to Borneo, for very many of them, if not all of them, it's the first time they've ever contemplated going to a place like Borneo. The jungle to them is either a terror, and in the early pages of the book you refer to Joseph Conrad's piece, which brings all of the illusions of apocalypse now. So you've got 20-year-old Australians plunged into this environment, and they don't know what they're fearing most. Are they fearing the Japanese? Are they fearing the Dayak headhunters? Or are they fearing the jungle itself? And the different responses that you elicited from the 80 to 90-year-olds when you interviewed them for your book. And so for a self-proclaimed sort of anti-military activist, how did you grow your relationship with these veterans? How did you find them individually and collectively? And with the benefit of writing the book and the experience you had of dealing with those diggers, what view do you have of their contribution? Because for any of the audience who've read your book, you form a very close association with a number of the old diggers, particularly one who was based in Adelaide, who you did very many interviews with and got into a friendship habit of having a conversation every Saturday afternoon for a lengthy period of time. So your view about the 20-year-olds who are plunged into this circumstance, and then what you take out of the contribution that they made, both individually and collectively.
Yes, I mean it's a great question. I came to meet Jack Tridria, the old veteran who was my very good friend, because someone in Borneo, actually a friend in Borneo who knew I was starting this project, said, "Did you know there's an old soldier in Adelaide who comes to Barrio, which is in the Kalabit Highlands in Borneo, every year to commemorate jumping in from a parachute. He feels this deep attachment to this place, so he comes every year." And she said, "You should go and talk to him because I think he might have been on this operation." And she gave me his phone number. So I phoned Jack, and I was very nervous about going to see him. He was the first, in spite of the fact that I'd started on this project on World War II in Borneo, he was the first Australian soldier I interviewed. And you and I are the same generation, Stephen. It's interesting, but, you know, as a sort of leftist anti-war activist, I look back now and I sort of feel ashamed about the way I felt about World War II soldiers. In a way, I think contempt is the wrong word, but I think I felt that, you know, they were involved in a war and I was anti-war and this was not a good thing for them to have done. And I never really sat down and thought about the reasons why they had gone to war in the first place, you know, what it was like for them. And actually, their reasons were all very good. They were wanting to protect family, they were wanting to protect, you know, community and so on and so forth. But I think I just had this idea that all soldiers were bad. So I went off to interview Jack in Adelaide, and in the first 15 minutes I said to Jack, you know, because I really wanted to know what were the jungles like in Borneo in 1945, because I loved the jungles when I was there in the 1980s. What did you think of them? And he just looked at me and he said, they were the most beautiful place on earth. He said they were magical. And there was something about that response. We just formed a rapport. And I interviewed Jack on that first occasion for 2 hours. I was then supposed to fly on to Perth the next day to interview another of the old veterans. And Jack said, why don't you come back tomorrow for fish and chips? Come and have lunch with me. So I postponed my flight to another day, went back and had fish and chips with him the next day. And we just became very, very close friends. As you say, in the last several years of his life, he died in 2018. We talked on the phone every Sunday afternoon, and he gave me a lot of absolutely key information about the operation. So I formed these deep relationships with 2 or 3 of the veterans, and I just found them quite wonderful old men. I think it was also the case with all the elderly Dayaks who I interviewed. There's something about people when they get very, very old, when they're in their 80s and their 90s, the things that we worry about, the anxieties that we have through the rest of our lives, most of them seem to have just let them go. And they're able to sort of tell it like it is in a way that no other age group I've ever interviewed has been able to do. So I actually loved working with very, very old people. I found it a really quite wonderful experience.
I think also, if you look at the way in which, because it was one of Australia's first special operations, there was a very high element of secrecy associated with it. People who went in one of the 4 sort of summit 1 to 4 operations were on threat of death, were told they had to take these secrets to their grave. So in addition to something which is not uncommon with return service personnel over any conflict, a reluctance to talk about it, even to close family. So in addition to that general reluctance, which we've experienced historically, you had this added layer of secrecy, and that, in a sense, compounded the felony that we didn't have a proper appreciation of the operations here and what had occurred. And so with your advantage of firstly having been on the ground from the 80s on, having established close relationships with the Dayak people and understanding of that, and then having to forge new relationships with diggers who were doing this in their early to mid-20s and now in their 80s and 90s. If I can move to the Dayak contribution and how you saw the Dayak contribution and how your relationship with the Dayak people enabled you to get a much better reading of the contribution that they had made, and also if you can just make some remarks about their attitude and approach to war and war fighting, which seemed to be very pragmatic, very practical, and often quite at odds with what a traditional sort of British, American, Australian war fighting personnel would seem to adopt. So just part of the book is about the contribution of the Dayak. That's a central feature of the book, but how you managed to tease that out and how you found in your conversations with them the sort of approach that they would actually take to joining up for this operation and then engaging in warlike activity.
That's a big question, Stephen. So let me just say, first of all, that one of the things that really stood out when I interviewed the old Australian veterans was that without exception, every one of them who had fought on an operation in Borneo said, this operation, we couldn't have survived a day on our own in the jungles without the Dayaks. They all just said over and over again, it was the Dayak people who won. Whatever victories we had in Borneo were won by them. And I write at the start of the book that when I told Jack that I was writing this book his only stipulation was you have to tell them how important the Dayaks were. So this both came out of my own sense as an anthropologist, but it was also sort of almost like a sacred pact that I had with these old diggers, as you call them. They believed that the Dayaks had been so important and that this contribution had never been recognised, that it had to be foregrounded in my book. And indeed, when I started doing the research, I found that that was absolutely the case. The Dayaks were just without a doubt the sort of backbone, the mainstay of this operation. I mean, when you stop and think about it, logically and rationally, that has to be the case. This was an operation that was taking place in dense Borneo jungle on Borneo rivers. In spite of their special operations training on Fraser Island, most of these Australian 20, 21-year-olds had never been in a jungle before. They couldn't move quietly. They all said to me that they moved like steamrollers in the jungles, they said. So, and jungle warfare, which is something that Dayaks had been practicing for generations. I mean, they'd been engaging in intertribal wars. They knew about jungle warfare. So they had the skills to do things like ambush an enemy, put an ambush in, and what they would do was they'd set an ambush and they'd tell the Australian operatives to stay like 200 metres away because they were just incapable of keeping quiet and incapable of keeping out of sight. And they were the ones who would track the enemy, all of these things that take part in jungle warfare. The operatives just didn't know how to do. So it wasn't just in terms of that on the ground, the basic warfare skills, but also they were the ones who knew the landscape, they knew the rivers, they knew the weather, they knew where the communities were, they knew the flora and fauna. So their input was absolutely pivotal to any kind of tactical and strategic planning as well. So, and also then, of course, they were providing the guides, they were providing the food, they were providing the shelter. I mean, without the Dayaks, this operation simply couldn't have got off the ground. There's no doubt about that. Now, just on your second question, which was about Dayak approaches to warfare, that's a very interesting thing that I did sort of touch on a few times in the book, that Dayaks generally, they're very, very pragmatic people. So I think that's one of the things that anthropologists generally say about Dayak, because they're very pragmatic. They have none of the sort of heroic impulses that Westerners have, and I think I'm probably with the Dayaks on this. So when I was doing my very early fieldwork before I started this project in southwest Borneo in the 1980s, I remember talking to a very old Dayak man on the Longhouse veranda one day about war, and I was saying, you don't think it's brave to sort of march into battle even though you know you're going to lose. And he just looked at me and said, "That's completely insane. Why would you want to fight an unwinnable battle?" He said, I remember very clearly, he said, "A wise man runs away so that he can fight another day." Whereas for us, the ultimate sort of heroism is to die in the unwinnable battle. But Dayaks just don't see warfare in those terms.
And you tell a really good anecdote in the book on this point, which is Dayaks and some Australian soldiers are there in preparation for an ambush, and one of the Dayaks comes to the conclusion, for whatever reason, that this is not a good idea, fires one shot into the air, which causes the ambush to be aborted, and when interrogated, essentially says, didn't seem like a good idea to do, so that's what I did. And they had to grapple with this sort of approach in an ongoing way.
Stephen, can I just add to what I said there, just to say that Dayaks don't share our sort of heroic ideal. It's not to say that they don't value bravery. They do value bravery, but they see bravery in slightly different kind. You don't throw your life away. That's not part of being brave. And the Australian soldiers all commented on their bravery, so it's not a question about bravery there.
Sure, understood. Now, we've got about 10 to 15 minutes to go, so I'm going to open it up to questions either from the Perth audience or online. There's a roving mic. So is there anyone in Perth or online who wants to sneak a question in? Otherwise, you'll have to suffer me interrogating Christine Moore. Yes, I've got this one just at the back and then there's one at the front. So it's easier to go to David in the front.
Okay, thanks very much. Christine, I must confess I haven't read the book. I only saw it for the first time today, but it looks fascinating. My question is what the reaction of the Malaysian government might be to this, or has been to this. whether any support was provided by them, whether any reaction has come from them, or whether any of the, I presume there are military organisations akin to the RSL in Malaysia that might have been interested in this work and might have had some comment on it, and I wondered what their reactions were. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, David. I have to be honest with you, it has been, especially given COVID, it has been a huge struggle getting this book into Malaysia. My publisher wasn't that interested in publicising it in Malaysia. So I've actually been doing publicity work myself. I've just done an event about 3 weeks ago with the Sarawak Museum in Kuching to try to get word of it out. I've been contacting bookshops in KL and in Penang, Kuala Lumpur and in Penang, to try to get the book into Malaysia. So I actually can't comment on that. And similarly, I'm not sure the Malaysian government at the moment even knows about this book. It would be very interesting to see how they might respond. I had no problems at all from either the Malaysian government or the Sarawak government getting the permits to do the research, even at a time when they were being a bit reluctant to give people permits to do other kinds of research. They did seem quite supportive of this research, I think probably partly because it was couched in terms of trying to research a local contribution to a World War II military operation.
Okay, I think we've got an online question. So Sharon, are you going to read that one out?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. The question is, what has been the most surprising response to the book so far?
Oh, the most surprising response to the book so far. I think the response that made me laugh the most probably was a review in one of the military journals, which was actually a very favourable review. But at the end of the review, his final shot was, he said something like, "The only thing I would say that I don't like about this book is the author's endless going on about the way the jungles are being cut down." I don't, when I'm reading a good military history, I don't want to be sidetracked by this kind of rubbish. He wrote something to that effect.
Okay, now I think we had a question at the back, just second last or last row.
I just wanted to make some comments and express my gratitude to Christine and Stephen. My grandfather was a prisoner of war in World War II, and I just wanted to say how I very much appreciated hearing about how you made friends with John in Adelaide, and got Jack, and got him talking about the war. My grandpa talked about the war a lot and wrote a book about it, and it's just really good to hear that you've made that friendship, and they can be quite formidable characters, the POWs. So I wanted to say good on you for going there. Thank you.
Was your grandfather a POW in Asia or in Europe?
In Asia.
And whereabouts? Sorry, just out of interest, which camp was he?
On the Thai Burma Railway.
Terrible.
Hellfire Pass.
Yeah, terrible.
Christine and I swapped an anecdote because as Defence and Foreign Minister, I generally do Anzac Day offshore, and so on one occasion I did it at Hellfire Pass, which is just enormous. But Christine and I discussed some of the anecdotes that I got from those diggers who likewise are in their 80s and 90s, and we both came to the conclusion that sort of a remarkable generation, the likes of which we probably won't see again, salt of the earth, very decent, and to them it was a terrible time, but you'd be forgiven for believing it was ever a problem for them in terms of what they went through, both in terms of fighting but also POWs. So quite a remarkable generation. I think we've got another one online, so Sharon?
Thanks, Stephen. Actually, I've got two I'll put together.
Yep.
The first one is, why did you title the book Semut? And the second question, I'm interested to know why the Dayak people sided with the Allies. Was the treatment by the Japanese such that the First Nations people were supportive of efforts to rid Borneo of them?
Yeah. Both great questions. So the book is called Semut because that's the name of the operation. It was called Operation Semut. And Semut, as many of you will probably know, is the Malay Indonesian word for ant. So it was called Operation Semut because the idea was that they were going to be like ants. They were sort of scuttling around, unseen, out of sight, but nevertheless able to sting. And those of you who've spent time at Borneo will know that Borneo ants really can sting, able to sting, when necessary. So that's where the title of Semut comes from. The second question, why the Dayaks sided with the Japanese, is a great question. Initially, again, Dayaks are very pragmatic people, and one of the points that I make strenuously in the book is that when they sided with the Allies for this operation, most of the commentary about the operation has said sided with the Allies because, the Allied colonial regimes had been so fantastically sort of beneficent, and the Dayaks just wanted them back. They just thought that the white people were fabulous and wanted them to come back. Naturally, they were going to side with the whites. And that's just, to me, a completely erroneous understanding of what happened. When the Japanese came to Borneo, it's quite clear that most Dayak groups actually didn't mind. As far as they were concerned, this was yet another colonial regime or another external regime that had come in to try and govern them. And throughout their history, they've been governed by lay sultans, they've been governed by James Brooke and the British, and now they've been governed by the Japanese. And as far as they were concerned, it was just another regime. But your questioner was absolutely right. The Japanese actually turned out to be worse, I think, than either the British Brooke regime or the Malay sultans. By the end of the war especially, there was a blockade on Borneo. The Allies had instituted a naval blockade. So food, medicines, etc. couldn't get into the island. There were a lot of Japanese soldiers there. They were starving. By the end of the war, I saw some figures when I was pouring through the military documents. By the end of the war, when the Australians invaded Borneo in June 1945, I think they said that something like 50% of the Japanese soldiers were so weak from starvation that they were unable to walk. So they were starving by the end. And as a result, they were taking food from locals. They'd been sort of fairly brutal, fairly cruel all the way through, but the last year or so became really very bad. And so what Dayaks told me in community after community where I visited them, that they would come into our community, they would just take our rice at gunpoint, they would take chickens, pigs, and, go away. And of course, Dayak people are living, they're subsistence cultivators. Without their rice, they're going to starve. So it had just become, Dayaks had got to a point where they were feeling very, very angry with the Japanese, and the operatives came in. They had a plan to actually try and oust the Japanese. They demonstrated that there were more and more of them coming in, and Dayaks, being the pragmatic people that they are, decided they could also see that the Japanese were in a bad way. They decided that, their better bet was to support the Allies than to support the Japanese.
Any one over there, is there? Yep, one at the back. Thanks.
Thanks. Having not read the book yet, I'm wondering how the relationship was formed in the first place. So how the approach was made to the Dayak
By the
initial overture.
Yeah. So they were very careful to include in each party at least one person who could speak Malay. And in each party, they also had someone who had some experience in Borneo. So the first party of 8, and it is a great story. They were very brave men. They dropped into Barrio in the Calabat Highlands, which is right in the centre of Borneo. And the reason they dropped there was that they wanted an inland area that they felt was going to be away from the Japanese. They were fairly certain that the Japanese were clustered on the coast, so they wanted to drop somewhere that was quite remote. And they dropped down into this community of Barrio. And I have a great story in the book. I hope you also think it's a great story, Stephen, where I interviewed, it was just a wonderful moment where I interviewed in 2015 a very old lady. She's since died, but she was then, I think, about 89, who talked about looking up, and she saw what she described to me as an umbrella coming down through the sky. It was an umbrella, she said to me, this umbrella. And she was so terrified. She thought it was spirit beings coming down to punish her community. She started to weep. So these 8 men, the initial party, came down with their umbrellas, landed at this very remote Dayak community. One of them was a fluent Malay speaker, but of course it turned out that this community was so remote that only the headman, only the chief spoke a little bit of Malay. But again, these people had, although they were too far away from the Japanese to have experienced really bad times under the Japanese, they were in touch with communities 1 or 2 days walk away. They knew the kinds of things that the Japanese were doing. So within sort of a day, they had persuaded this community to come on side. And from there, they then travelled across the mountains to this great Kenya chief, Tamawing Ajing, at the top of the Barang River. And he was the chief they desperately needed to get on side. And there's quite a lot in the book about the negotiations with Tamawing Ajing. They talked for, I think it was about 3 or 4 days and nights with him and all of his lieutenants up and down the Barang River. And basically it all came back to questions of pragmatics again. These questions, will we be given arms? How many more people are coming in? When will the Australians be invading? Once they'd gone through all those questions over and over again, Tamawing Ajing and all of his lieutenants up and down the Barang River decided to come on side. And that was the kind of start, really, of the operation. So it was really just a question of talking to people, persuading them. And of course, as I say, they were very lucky in that the leader of the operation, the one who crossed the mountains to negotiate with Tamawing Ajing, actually knew Tamawing Ajing. I should have made that point. He was a New Zealand surveyor who had actually worked up and down that river. He knew Tamawing Ajing and I think he regarded Tamawing Ajing as a friend. So Tamawing could trust him. He knew that he could trust him not to be sort of, spinning him stories or telling him lies. And it all sort of went from there, basically.
I think that's a really good part of the book, Christine, because you've got, in one same section of the book, you've got the paratroopers above. They're about to be secretly dropped into the middle of Borneo. There's the nervous disposition on the plane where nervousness takes over the fear. They all jump out, and then a few pages later, you've got the description of that woman who heard a noise she'd never heard before. Normally, she'd hear the sound of birds flying, including large birds, and then she sees this the parachutes coming and describes them in her own terms, and it ends up weeping. So it's a very evocative part of the book. I think it's a really good anecdote. I think we've got one more, Sharon, online.
Yes, one final question. Can Christine talk about Toby Carter, who is on the cover of the book?
Yes, and that is Toby Carter, who does the person asking the question, do they know Toby Carter, or is it just a question out of?
I think it's just
a question. Okay, so
yeah.
So Toby Carter was the leader of the operation. He's the man I just talked about, the surveyor. He was actually a New Zealander, like me, so I had a particular fondness for Toby Carter. He was a surveyor. He had actually joined the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, and he was drafted in for this operation precisely because he had spent many years as a surveyor in Borneo. He not only spoke Malay, but he actually spoke some Kenya and some Kayan, the two of the sort of really important languages for the area where he was going. And Toby Carter was, I think, quite a remarkable man. If you read the book, you will see, and I don't know if you agree with me, Stephen, that he got shafted, I think, by the British and the Australian establishment, but I won't go any further into that. I'll leave the readers to discover that, because I think that's one of the kind of key moments of the book as well. But yes, so Toby Carter, he was the leader of the operation, and that photo that you see on the cover is at the moment when he's just crossed the mountains on his way to Tamawing Ajing's longhouse.
I think I'm going to have to wind up now, Christine. That's been terrific. I think one general point I'd make is in the fog of war, people see things differently. Each individual sees things from a slightly different perspective. Some people understate their involvement, other people overstate their involvement, other people just repeat the slither that they saw, which is just one fragment. And I think the real joy that your book brings to any military historian is that for the first time we've actually gone round to all the people who were on the ground and done the assiduous research from that perspective, but also done the assiduous research from the Dayak perspective. So you're not going to win the military history awards here, because already there are some reviews which say, no, she's got it wrong. Harrison was the key, not Carter, you know. Don't know why she's so soft on Carter. So you won't win those sort of military sort of analysis awards, but you do bring a terrific matrix of evidence which has previously just been lost to Australian history, not just Australian military history. So in wrapping up my final question, of course, this is a 563 sort of odd page book with volumes of footnotes and appendices, etc. But you only deal with 2 of the operations, and so you've committed yourself in the writing of the book to book number 2. So my question is, having done this one, where's book number 2 and when's that coming out?
Book number 2 is a bit further down the track. I mean, I have to say, I ended book number 1 absolutely exhausted. It was a huge amount of work. I would say, so book number 2, just for your audience, book number 1 deals with 2 of these 4 operations, deals with Semut 2 and Semut 3. Book number 1 will deal with Semut 1 and Semut 4. I would say it's probably about 2 years down the track. There's still quite a lot of work to be done for Semut 1.
Well, knowing you as we do from your first book, it'll be assiduously researched, and it'll be a very easy read, because it is very easy to read, but it's also a beautiful read. So, Christine, thanks very much for giving us your time on a Canberra night. It's a fantastic book, a fantastic contribution. We wish you every success with it, and we look forward to seeing book number 2 on the other 2 summit operations. So could we please thank Christine in the usual way. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks very much. I think you're...
So thanks, Stephen, for joining us today. We would like to present him with this hand-woven scarf created by women weavers from Bali. Thank you, Stephen.